What if every single relationship in your life has been built on a lie? Not a lie you told to others, but a lie you told yourself. The lie that says, if you keep making everyone around you comfortable, if you keep swallowing your needs, your opinions, your truth, if you keep shrinking yourself to fit into whatever space the people around you have decided you deserve, then eventually, somehow, you will be loved. You will be safe. You will finally be enough. That lie has cost you everything. It has cost you your identity. It has cost you your confidence. It has cost you years of your life spent doing things you did not want to do for people who never truly respected you. It has cost you relationships that could have been real, because you were never real inside them. It has cost you the version of yourself that was supposed to show up in this world, fully, without apology, without shrinking, without performing some version of yourself designed to be acceptable to everyone except you. And the most painful part of all, you knew it was happening deep down. In those quiet moments when you agreed to something that made your stomach turn, when you smiled through something that was breaking your heart, when you said it is fine, while it was very clearly not fine at all, you felt it. That hollow, aching feeling that comes from betraying yourself over and over and over again. You felt it, and you kept going anyway. Because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. This is not a book about learning to be more assertive. This is not a collection of polite tips on how to say no without offending anyone. What you are about to go through is a complete and total dismantling of one of the most deeply ingrained psychological patterns a human being can carry through their life. People-pleasing is not a personality quirk. It is not a sign of exceptional kindness. It is not something to be proud of or to wear as a badge of how much you care about others. It is a survival mechanism, one that made sense once, in a different chapter of your life, when you were smaller and the world felt bigger and more threatening than you could manage alone. But survival mechanisms have a way of outliving their usefulness. They have a way of becoming the very thing that imprisons you. And that is exactly what has happened here. By the time you finish this, you will understand with absolute clarity why you became this way. You will see the hidden mechanisms of this pattern operating in corners of your life you never thought to examine. You will have everything you need to break free from it permanently, to build boundaries that actually hold, and to begin living, perhaps for the first time, as someone who genuinely values themselves, not someone who performs self-worth when an audience is watching, someone who carries it quietly, powerfully, and unshakably, in every room they walk into, in every conversation they have, in every moment when they are alone with nothing but their own reflection. This is the most important work you will ever do. Let us begin. Chapter 1. What people-pleasing really is. Let us start with what almost nobody wants to say out loud. People-pleasing is not about being a good person. It has nothing to do with genuine generosity, authentic compassion, or real kindness. Those things exist, and they are beautiful, and they look absolutely nothing like what you have been doing. Real generosity comes from abundance. It comes from a person who has so much warmth and energy and love available that sharing it feels natural, easy, right. What you have been doing comes from a completely different place. It comes from fear, fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as difficult, selfish, demanding, or simply too much. Fear that if you stop performing, if you stop bending yourself into whatever shape the people around you need you to be in any given moment, they will leave. And if they leave, something you have quietly believed about yourself for a very long time will be confirmed. That you are not worth staying for. That you are only loved when you are useful. That the moment you stop giving, the moment you stop agreeing, the moment you stop making everyone around you comfortable and accommodated and cared for, the love disappears. Because the love was never really for you. It was for what you provided. That is what people-pleasing actually is at its core. It is a constant, exhausting, invisible negotiation with the world. A negotiation where you give everything and ask for nothing. Because asking feels dangerous. Because needing something feels like a weakness that could be used against you. Because somewhere along the line, in circumstances you may not even fully remember now, you learned that your needs were a burden and other people's needs were the only ones that mattered. You learned it well. You learned it so well that by now it operates completely automatically, beneath the level of conscious thought, shaping every interaction before you even realize what is happening. And here is the thing that makes it so insidious and so difficult to see clearly. From the outside, people-pleasing looks like virtue. It looks like selflessness. It looks like the kind of goodness the world is supposed to celebrate. And in many ways the world does celebrate it. People call you kind. They call you easygoing. They call you a great friend, a reliable colleague, a person who just makes everything easier for everyone around them. And you absorb those descriptions like water into dry earth, because they feel like proof. Proof that you belong here. Proof that you are valued. But here is what those descriptions actually are. They are not compliments. They are observations about how convenient you are. There is a difference between being a genuinely kind person and being someone who has organized their entire existence around the terror of disappointing others. A kind person helps because it feels good to give. A people-pleaser helps because they are frightened of what happens if they do not. A kind person says no when they have nothing left to give, and feels at peace with that decision. A people-pleaser says yes while running on absolute empty, then lies awake afterward wondering why they feel invisible and resentful and hollow when they have done so much for so many people. That resentment is crucial. Pay close attention to it whenever it surfaces. Because resentment is precisely what shows up when you have given something you did not actually want to give. Every time you agreed to something that violated your own needs. Every time you said yes when your entire body was saying no. That resentment accumulated, layer upon layer upon layer. Like sediment, settling at the bottom of a river over years and decades. And you carry all of it now. You carry it into conversations where you smile more than you feel. You carry it into relationships where you work twice as hard as the other person and receive half as much. You carry it into the privacy of your own mind, where you replay interactions late at night, analyzing every word you said, worrying that someone somewhere might be even slightly disappointed in you. This is the lived reality of people-pleasing, not a life of kindness, a life of quiet, relentless self-erasure, dressed up as something admirable and presented to the world as though it costs nothing. The first step to ending it is seeing it honestly and clearly for exactly what it is. Not a personality trait you were born with. Not something that defines the core of who you are. A pattern, a learned behavior, a strategy you developed at a specific point in your history to navigate a world that felt unsafe and a version of love that felt conditional. And strategies that no longer serve you can be unlearned. That is the entire purpose of what lies ahead. Chapter 2. Where it all begins. Nobody is born a people pleaser. That is the first and most important thing you need to understand, because it changes everything about how you see yourself and this pattern. When you arrived in this world, you had no concept of hiding your needs or managing other people's emotional states. You cried when you were hungry. You reached without hesitation for whatever you wanted. You expressed discomfort or frustration or fear without a single thought about how it might land with the people around you. You were completely, unapologetically, fully present in your own experience. That version of you had never learned that being yourself could be dangerous. Something happened to change that. And for the vast majority of people who carry people-pleasing patterns deep into adulthood, that something did not look dramatic or obviously traumatic. It did not look like a single catastrophic moment you could point to clearly and say, "There, that is exactly where it started." That is the precise event that changed everything. It looked ordinary. It looked like everyday life. It looked like the cumulative weight of thousands of small moments, each individually seeming insignificant, but collectively rewiring the way you understood yourself and your place in the world. Maybe you grew up in a home where certain emotions were not welcome, where expressing anger resulted in punishment or in a withdrawal of warmth, where sadness made a parent uncomfortable or impatient or dismissive, where your needs were described as selfish, where your feelings were called dramatic or oversensitive, where the unspoken but clearly communicated rule was that keeping the peace in the household mattered more than whatever you were actually experiencing. In that environment, you learned quickly. You learned that the version of you who felt things loudly and reached for what you needed was a version that created problems for the people around you. And so you began, quietly, gradually, without anyone explicitly instructing you to become whoever the room needed you to be. Maybe you had a parent whose moods were volatile and unpredictable, whose reactions were disproportionate, and whose emotional state could shift without warning in ways that made ordinary life feel inherently unsafe. And as a child navigating that landscape daily, you developed a skill that presented itself as survival. You learned to read the room before you stepped into it. You learned to scan for warning signs in the set of someone's jaw or the particular flatness of a voice, to adjust your own behavior and energy the moment the atmosphere shifted, to make yourself smaller and quieter and more agreeable. Because that was the strategy that consistently reduced the risk of the storm breaking directly over you. You became extraordinarily sensitive to the emotional states of the people around you, not because you were born with exceptional empathic gifts, but because accurately tracking those states was literally how you stayed safe. That sensitivity was an adaptation, a tool forged in a specific environment, and like all tools, it served you in the context it was built for. The problem is that you are still using it in contexts that are entirely different, and it is costing you far more than it is protecting you. Maybe love in your home operated on a conditional basis in a slightly different way. Maybe it was given in direct proportion to achievement, to compliance, to being the good one, the responsible one. the child who did not create difficulty or demand attention in uncomfortable ways. Maybe that role was rewarded with approval and warmth, and a kind of pride that felt genuinely good, and that you understood very early you needed to keep earning. In that dynamic, love became a transaction whose terms you had no part in setting. Something to be earned through sustained performance, rather than something that existed as a given simply because you were there and you were theirs. And so your nervous system absorbed a foundational lesson. The way to keep love coming is to keep performing, to keep being the version of yourself that generates approval, to suppress whatever parts of yourself do not. Maybe the wound came from somewhere else entirely, from peers who rejected you the moment you showed them something real about yourself, from a social environment where belonging required a degree of self-suppression you were willing to pay because being included felt worth any price. Maybe it came from early relationships where you discovered, through painful experience, that expressing your genuine thoughts or needs or feelings caused the other person to pull away, or to become cold or critical or distant. And so you learned to keep those things hidden, to present instead a version of yourself shaped for acceptance rather than authenticity, and to track very carefully the distance between those two versions of you, so that you never inadvertently showed too much of the real one to anyone who mattered. All of these experiences, regardless of how different they look in their specific details, teach the same lesson at the level of the nervous system. The lesson that who you actually are, in your fullness, with your opinions and your limits and your needs and your inconvenient truths, is not enough. That the authentic version of you carries too much risk to show. That it is safer and more practical and more effective to present instead a version designed for approval, a version built to please, to pacify, to accommodate endlessly. And you have been living as that version for so long, and in so many dimensions of your life, that you may have genuinely lost clear sight of the original. You may have begun, somewhere along the way, to confuse the performance with the person, but the person is still there, underneath all of this. Underneath the reflexive agreements and the dissolved opinions and the relentless monitoring of everyone else's emotional states. The work ahead is not about constructing an entirely new self from the ground up. It is about something more honest and more profound than that. It is about excavating the one that was always there, waiting for exactly this moment. Chapter 3. The hidden patterns you don't see in yourself. People pleasers are almost always the last to recognize themselves when someone describes people pleasing. That is not coincidental. These patterns are so thoroughly interwoven into the texture of daily behavior, so comprehensively normalized through years and sometimes decades of unbroken repetition, that they stop registering as patterns at all. They feel like personality. They feel like the natural expression of how your particular mind works and how you prefer to engage with the world. They feel like just who you are. And that quality of invisibility, that seamless integration into your sense of self, is precisely what makes them so persistent and so difficult to interrupt. You cannot challenge what you cannot see. So the first task is to make the invisible visible. The first pattern is the automatic yes. Someone makes a request, any request at all, and before your conscious mind has had even a fraction of a second to process whether you actually want to fulfill it, your mouth has already produced the agreement. The yes arrives before the reflection. It is not a considered response that emerges from a genuine assessment of your availability or desire or capacity. It is a reflex. It is the path of least social resistance, the response that neutralizes the discomfort of potentially disappointing someone before that discomfort has even fully formed. You say yes, and then somewhere just behind your eyes, something tightens slightly. Some small but persistent part of you registers that the yes was not accurate, and you file that away and carry it forward. A small, quiet debt to yourself that you will not acknowledge and cannot collect. The second pattern is the constant surveillance. People pleasers are rarely fully present in any given conversation or interaction, and the reason for that partial absence is that a significant and non-negotiable portion of their attention is permanently allocated to watching the other person's face for the earliest possible signs of displeasure, scanning the room for subtle shifts in energy or emotional temperature, monitoring tone of voice, body language, the micro-expressions that flicker across someone's face before their words arrive, the particular weight of a pause in a conversation, always running the interior calculation. Are they okay? Did I say something wrong? Are they upset with me? Did that come across the way I intended it to? Is there something I should be doing differently right now? This monitoring is relentless, and the cognitive and emotional cost of it is enormous. It means that you rarely experience human interaction the way a person with a secure sense of self does, because half of you is always positioned slightly outside the moment, watching it, assessing it, managing it, bracing for the version of it where something goes wrong. The third pattern is the apology reflex. You apologize for things that carry no genuine need for apology. You apologize for having needs, for asking a question, for taking up physical space in a room, for existing in a way that might, in some theoretical scenario that has not even materialized, inconvenience someone around you. You preface requests or statements with "sorry to bother you," or "I am probably wrong about this," or "I don't know. This might be a stupid question." You apologize when someone walks into you. Each of these apologies, observed individually, appears to be a minor social grace. Observed collectively, across the full pattern of how you move through your life, they constitute a continuous declaration. A declaration that your presence requires justification, that you are an inconvenience until you have demonstrated otherwise, that you occupy ground you are not entirely certain you deserve. The fourth pattern is what happens to your opinions under the slightest pressure. In a group, a person operating primarily from people-pleasing patterns will typically hold off on forming or sharing a perspective until they have heard what the others present seem to think. And when they do venture an opinion, it arrives pre-qualified, pre-apologized for, hedged before it has even fully left their mouth. "I think, maybe, but I could easily be wrong. I am not sure. What do you all think?" And if someone responds with even mild disagreement, even without particular conviction or forcefulness, the opinion collapses. Not because the challenge introduced genuinely new information that warranted a real reconsideration, but because disagreement, even minor and unthreatening disagreement, triggers in your nervous system something that feels like danger. And when danger appears, the fastest way to make it recede is to remove the source of the friction, which is your own contrary view. So you dissolve the opinion and restore the apparent harmony and move forward, carrying the particular kind of fatigue that comes from never being allowed to think a thought through to its natural and honest conclusion. The fifth pattern is the resentment you have learned to not allow yourself to name. You give, consistently and generously, often at significant cost to your own time and energy and peace of mind. You help when you have nothing available to give. You show up when you would rather be anywhere else. You accommodate requests that violate your own needs. And then, beneath all of that giving, something that feels uncomfortably like anger begins to quietly build. Not targeted anger at any particular individual necessarily, but a diffuse and pervasive resentment at the dynamic, at the structure of your relationships, at the role you always somehow find yourself occupying. And what do you do with that resentment when you notice it stirring? You tell yourself it is irrational. You tell yourself you are being ungrateful or unfair toward people who never explicitly asked you to sacrifice this much. You dismiss it, stuff it somewhere below awareness, and then give more, as if additional generosity performed with sufficient conviction will somehow cancel out and neutralize the anger accumulating underneath. It never does. It simply grows in the place you have decided not to look. The sixth pattern is your relationship with conflict itself, not as a natural dimension of human interaction, not as the sometimes uncomfortable but often clarifying process through which people come to understand each other more completely, but as a genuine emergency requiring immediate containment. When conflict begins to appear anywhere near a relationship you depend on, or a dynamic you have worked to maintain, the full force of your people-pleasing machinery activates in service of de-escalation. You absorb blame that does not belong to you, because accepting it ends the argument faster. You make yourself smaller in the presence of someone else's anger, because shrinking reduces the apparent threat surface. You stay silent about things that matter, because raising them might disturb a peace that already, if you are being completely honest with yourself, exists mostly in performance. And in doing all of this, you teach the people around you something that they did not need to be told explicitly in order to absorb. You teach them that your limits are suggestions, that your feelings are negotiable, that the emotional equilibrium of the relationship is your responsibility to maintain, regardless of what it costs you to do so. Look at all of this with honesty, and without the self-condemnation that honesty can sometimes produce. Not to shame yourself for the person you have been, but to finally, clearly, completely see the architecture of what has been running your life without your fully conscious participation. You cannot dismantle a structure you refuse to examine carefully. These patterns exist. They have been operating for a long time, and seeing them with precision is not weakness. It is the single most courageous act this entire process will require of you. Chapter 4. Why being nice is slowly destroying you. There is a story our culture tells about nice people. The story says they are good. It says they are morally elevated, that they hold things together, that communities and workplaces and families function better because these people are in them, quietly smoothing the edges of every interaction, absorbing the friction, making the whole machinery of social life run with less resistance. Society rewards this quality in observable ways. It promotes the easygoing and gravitates toward the accommodating and smiles most warmly at the person who makes no difficult demands and produces no uncomfortable friction. You have spent a long time absorbing this story. You have spent years believing that your willingness to bend, to accommodate, to prioritize the needs and comfort of others is one of your most valuable and admirable qualities. Something that makes you not just pleasant to be around, but genuinely better than people who hold firm boundaries and say what they actually mean without first checking whether it will be well received. Here is what that story systematically leaves out. The cost. The real, specific, compounding, cumulative cost of performing niceness as a substitute for genuine self-respect. When you consistently say yes, while your actual interior experience is registering a clear and unmistakable no, something happens in your nervous system that you need to understand. Not a single dramatic alarm, not an acute crisis, but the activation of a chronic, low-grade stress response. The signal of ongoing self-betrayal. And the human body responds to sustained self-betrayal the way it responds to any prolonged stressor. It adapts, but the adaptation comes at a cost. Over time, anxiety becomes your baseline state, rather than something you experience in response to specific, genuine threats. Not necessarily dramatic, acute anxiety, but a persistent background tension, a quality of never being quite settled, never quite fully at rest, always operating with some portion of your nervous system on alert. You feel tired in ways that sleeping cannot fix, because the exhaustion is not primarily physical. It is the exhaustion of a person who has been performing without interruption for years and has never once been allowed to fully step off stage and simply exist without an audience to manage. You carry a formless, hovering anxiety through your days, even when nothing in your external life specifically justifies it. Your body stores tension in ways that seem disconnected from any particular cause. Your mind runs circular loops of social analysis in the hours when you should be resting. You experience a vague and persistent sense that you are always one misstep away from something going wrong, even when everything visible appears to be fine. And through all of it, you keep performing, because stopping the performance feels more threatening than sustaining it, even as sustaining it quietly drains you of things you cannot easily name or replace. That is the internal cost. And it is enormous. But it does not confine itself to your interior life. Look carefully at what chronic people-pleasing does to the quality and nature of the relationships in your life. When you operate without any real or consistent boundaries, you do not draw people who respect you for who you genuinely are. You draw people who are comfortable in a dynamic where they receive without equivalent reciprocity. You draw people who have learned, through the consistent evidence of your behavior over time, that your yes is readily available, and that your no is unlikely to appear. You draw people who, whether they are fully conscious of this or not, have organized their relationship with you around the assumption of your continued accommodation, and those relationships, however warm or familiar they may feel in certain moments, are not built on genuine, mutual regard. They are not built on the kind of honest, reciprocal respect that sustains a relationship through difficulty. They are built on the continued availability of what you are willing to provide. The people who might have offered you something genuinely different, the ones who are self-possessed enough to actually respect a boundary when they encounter one, who are emotionally healthy enough to handle the word no without treating it as a personal attack, those people often drift away from people-pleasers. Not out of cruelty or judgment, but because something in the dynamic feels off in a way they may not be able to immediately articulate. Because a person who agrees with everything, who bends readily to every preference, who has no stable, visible edges of their own, is someone who is genuinely difficult to connect with at any real depth. Authentic connection requires two actual people. It requires both parties to be actually present, actually themselves, actually willing to occupy the space of who they are with some degree of firmness. You cannot form a true and nourishing bond with a mirror. And that, over time, is what a consistent people-pleaser becomes in the eyes of the people around them. A surface that reflects back whatever they bring, with nothing of its own held steady. And then there is what it does to the thing that arguably matters most: your relationship with yourself. Every single time you override your own needs in service of someone else's comfort, every time you suppress your truth to maintain someone else's ease, you transmit a message to your own nervous system. The message says, yours matters less. Your experience matters less. You matter less. And the brain, which is a sophisticated and efficient pattern recognition system, receives this message and files it alongside all the previous identical messages, and continues building the case for a belief that may have been forming since you were very young. The belief that you are fundamentally less deserving of consideration than the people you share your life with. That your role is to give, to facilitate, to smooth, to serve. That your value resides in your usefulness rather than in your existence. That belief is false, but it has been reinforced with such consistency through such a high volume of individual acts of self-abandonment that by now it carries the emotional weight and the felt quality of simple fact. And so the cycle maintains itself without requiring any external force to sustain it. You believe you matter less, so you consistently act as though you matter less, which generates further behavioral evidence that confirms the belief, which deepens your conviction that it is simply accurate, which produces more of the same behavior. A loop of extraordinary efficiency, closing around itself and maintaining its structure without any conscious input from you. Being nice is not destroying you because kindness is harmful or because generosity is misguided. Kindness is among the most powerful and most necessary things a human being can offer the world. It is destroying you because what you have been practicing is not kindness. It is the performance of kindness as a strategy for managing your own fear. It is the consistent, daily sacrifice of your authentic self on the altar of other people's comfort. And no person was designed to spend their entire life in that particular act of disappearance. Chapter 5. What you're really searching for. Underneath every single act of people-pleasing, beneath every automatic agreement and every suppressed opinion and every boundary quietly surrendered without a fight, there is a need. And that need is never actually about making the other person happy. Making them happy is the method. The method is not the goal. The need itself is something far more basic, far more universal, far more deeply human than any strategy built around it could ever suggest. The need is to belong, to be genuinely seen, to be loved not in the abstract, not in theory, not on the condition that you successfully maintain an acceptable performance, but actually, fully, in the honest and unedited completeness of who you really are, when no one is evaluating you. That is what has been driving this entire pattern. That is the hunger underneath the hunger. the need beneath all the strategies and the accommodations and the years of self-suppression. And the cruel and almost unbearable irony that sits at the absolute center of all of it is this. The strategy you have been using your entire life to meet that need is the one strategy that is structurally incapable of ever satisfying it. Here is the mechanism that makes this true. When you people please, you do not allow anyone to actually see you. What you allow them to see is a version of you. A version that has been carefully and continuously edited, stripped of anything that felt too risky to expose, recalibrated for maximum acceptability in the presence of whoever is standing in front of you at any given moment. And when someone responds to that version with warmth, with validation, with approval, with the sense that they like you and value you and want you around, something in you knows, with a certainty that operates completely below the level of conscious thought, that it does not actually count. Not fully, not the way it would need to count to fill the space you are trying to fill, because they did not love you. They loved the version of you that never disagrees, never inconveniences, never asks for more than is conveniently on offer. They loved the performance, and somewhere beneath all of the performing, a persistent and quiet voice says, "But if they saw what I actually felt, if they knew what I actually needed, if they experienced the uncurated truth of who I am on a difficult day, when I am tired or scared or angry or uncertain, they would not stay." That voice is the wound. And the people-pleasing is the elaborate armor that was constructed around the wound, designed to keep anyone from getting close enough to confirm what it has always feared is true. The armor feels like protection. But armor, by definition, also prevents contact. It keeps out the very thing you are most urgently desperate to receive. What you are really searching for, at the most stripped-down and fundamental level, is proof that you are enough. Not enough contingent on being useful. Not enough provided that you have successfully managed everyone's emotional state and met every implicit expectation and created no friction and asked for nothing in return. Enough as an unconditional baseline. Enough simply because you are here. Enough because you exist, and your existence has inherent value that does not need to be earned or demonstrated or maintained through performance. And until you are able to generate that proof from within yourself, through your own choices and your own evolving relationship with who you are, no quantity of external validation will ever be sufficient to provide it. You will move from one person to the next, from one relationship to the next, from one moment of approval to the next. And every time the validation arrives, it will feel good for exactly as long as it takes for the fear to stir again and ask, "But what if next time they see something they do not like? What if next time the performance is not good enough? What if next time they do not stay?" The exhaustion you carry in this cycle is real, and it is profound. And it is the exhaustion of a specific kind of futility. The futility of chasing something that moves every time you approach it. Because what other people think of you was never genuinely capable of giving you what you were actually looking for. It was always a proxy, a functional substitute for the real thing, offering a simulation of the feeling that was close enough to temporarily satisfy the craving but never close enough to actually eliminate it. And, like all substitutes engaged with in quantities large enough to compensate for the absence of the real thing, it requires more and more of it over time to produce less and less of the effect you are seeking. What you are searching for does not live in another person's approval. It does not live in the absence of conflict, or in the relief of being agreed with, or in the warmth that comes from being told you are wonderful by someone whose opinion you have organized your behavior around securing. It lives somewhere else. It lives in the moments when you say something true out loud, and you are still standing afterward. When you hold a position under pressure, and the relationship survives it. When you choose something for yourself without spiraling into guilt and discover that the consequences were manageable. When you sit with your own company, with no performance required and no audience present, and feel something that is genuinely and simply enough. Those are the moments that build the thing you have been looking for in every other direction. Real self-worth is not a thought you arrive at through sufficient contemplation. It is not an affirmation you can repeat into existence. It is a lived experience that is constructed slowly, through accumulation, through the steady building of evidence that you can trust yourself to choose yourself, that the world does not collapse when you take up the space that is yours, that you are capable of being real and remaining loved. It is built through thousands of small, deliberate, sometimes frightening acts of choosing your own truth over the easier path of accommodation. Each one is a deposit. The account does not fill overnight, but it fills in a way that borrowed validation never could, because it belongs entirely to you and cannot be taken away by someone else's change of mood or change of mind. You are not waiting for the person who will finally love you in the way you deserve to be loved, and whose love will make all of this okay. You are becoming the source of that recognition for yourself. You are learning to see yourself with honesty and with care. You are learning to extend to yourself the same consistency of consideration you have been extending so freely and so automatically to every person who has crossed your path. And that shift, quiet as it may appear when described in words, rearranges everything. It rearranges what you will accept and what you will offer and what you will permit to continue. It rearranges who enters your life and what those relationships are built upon and how long they last and what they actually give you. It rearranges the quality of every single ordinary day from this point forward. That is what this is really about. Not the techniques, not the scripts for difficult conversations. The thing underneath all of that, your relationship with yourself. And that relationship begins to change right now. Chapter 6. Rewiring Yourself. Worth from the inside out. Here is something nobody tells you when they talk about building confidence or developing self-worth or learning to value yourself. They make it sound like a decision, like one day you simply choose to believe you are enough, and from that point forward, you operate from that belief without difficulty. They make it sound like an internal switch that, once flipped, stays in the on position permanently and transforms the way you move through every situation you encounter. And because that is the version of the story most commonly told, many people spend years waiting for that switch to reveal itself, waiting for the moment of clarity, the realization, the emotional breakthrough that will finally make them feel worthy from the inside rather than dependent on the outside for the feeling. That moment does not come, not in the way it is described. And the waiting for it is itself a trap, because it keeps you passive in the face of something that requires active construction. Self-worth is not a realization. It is not a feeling that arrives and then remains. It is an accumulation. It is built, slowly, and without fanfare, through the compounding effect of thousands of small choices made over time. Choices that align with the person you actually are, rather than the person others find most convenient. Choices that prioritize your own honest experience without requiring external permission to do so. Choices that, taken individually, may seem almost trivially small, but that taken together across weeks and months and years constitute the foundation of a genuinely different relationship with yourself. The first thing you need to understand about rewiring self-worth is that it requires you to stop outsourcing the evaluation of your own value. Right now, whether you are fully conscious of this or not, you are running a continuous internal process in which you measure your worth by checking it against other people's responses to you. When someone is warm and approving, the needle moves up. When someone is cold or critical or disappointed, the needle moves down. Your sense of yourself on any given day is substantially determined by the aggregate of other people's reactions to you, which means your sense of yourself is almost entirely outside your control. Someone else's bad mood becomes your internal crisis. Someone else's brief inattention becomes evidence of your inadequacy. Someone else's entirely separate and unrelated emotional state becomes data about your worth. And you are exhausted by this process because you are fundamentally unable to control the inputs. The work of rewiring begins with a practice that sounds deceptively simple and is in reality one of the most demanding things a person can attempt. The practice of pausing before reacting to someone else's response to you and asking yourself what you actually think about what you just did or said or chose. Not what they seem to think, not what the room seems to think, what you think. Because somewhere inside you, beneath all the monitoring and managing and outsourcing, there is a perspective that belongs entirely to you, a perspective on your own choices and your own behavior and your own worth that has been chronically suppressed in favor of the faster and more available feedback of other people's reactions. Reclaiming that perspective is the beginning of everything. This means developing what you might think of as an internal standard, a set of values and principles that belong to you and that you use to evaluate your own behavior, independent of whether the people around you happen to agree with the evaluation. This is not about becoming arrogant or indifferent to legitimate feedback. It is about having a home base, a stable internal reference point that does not disappear the moment someone expresses displeasure with you. When you have an internal standard, other people's criticism becomes information to be considered rather than a verdict to be accepted. You can hear it, examine it, decide whether it reflects something true about your behavior, and respond accordingly, without the entire foundation of your self-perception collapsing in the process. The second component of rewiring self-worth is learning to tolerate discomfort without immediately treating it as a sign that something has gone wrong. People pleasers have an extraordinarily low threshold for interpersonal discomfort, and that low threshold is part of what drives the pattern. The moment a situation begins to feel uncomfortable, the pleasing behaviors activate automatically in an attempt to restore ease. But discomfort is not inherently dangerous. Discomfort is frequently the feeling that accompanies growth, the sensation of a boundary being held when it has not been held before, the texture of staying with your own truth when the easier thing would be to release it. Learning to sit with that discomfort without immediately moving to dissolve it, learning to distinguish between the discomfort of genuine danger and the discomfort of simply doing something new and unfamiliar, is one of the most important skills this process will develop in you. The third component is consistency in self-care. and not in the shallow sense that word has acquired from overuse. Not face masks and long baths, though there is nothing wrong with those things. Consistency in the care you take of your own needs on a daily basis. The degree to which you treat your own rest and your own nutrition and your own time and your own emotional needs as things that genuinely matter, not as things to be attended to only after everyone else's needs have been fully addressed. Every time you treat your own needs as a genuine priority rather than an afterthought, you send your nervous system a different message from the one it has been receiving. You send it the message that you matter, that your experience counts, and that message, received consistently over time, begins to slowly and permanently shift the internal architecture of how you relate to yourself. The fourth component, and perhaps the most counterintuitive, is allowing yourself to be seen in moments of imperfection or difficulty without immediately moving to manage other people's perception of those moments. People pleasers are often perfectionists in a specific and exhausting way. They work frantically to appear capable and together and fine, because appearing otherwise might invite judgment, might disappoint someone, might reduce the approval they depend on. But authentic self-worth is not built through the sustained performance of adequacy. It is built in the moments when you are honest about struggling and discover that you are still okay, when you show someone your real experience and discover they remain, when you make a mistake and respond to it with honest accountability rather than shame-driven self-destruction, and find that the world continues and you continue in it. Those moments are irreplaceable. They cannot be simulated or hurried. But you can create the conditions for them to happen more frequently by choosing, consistently, the discomfort of honesty over the temporary comfort of performance. This is the long work, the real work, and it asks more of you than any technique or framework or list of strategies ever could. It asks you to be willing to feel less certain, for a period, in exchange for something eventually and permanently more real. Chapter 7. Learning to say no without guilt or explanation. The word no is one of the shortest words in the language. 2 letters, 1 syllable, 0 ambiguity. And yet for someone operating from a lifetime of people-pleasing patterns, it might as well be a sentence in a foreign language that they understand perfectly in theory, but are functionally unable to produce in real time. The throat tightens. The mind races. The elaborate internal machinery of justification and preemptive damage control activates in the fraction of a second between the request and the required response. And what comes out, almost invariably, is some version of yes, or a yes masquerading as a maybe, or a deflection that postpones the confrontation without actually resolving it. Anything to avoid the clean and honest sound of the word that would have actually served you. Let us start with the guilt, because the guilt is real, and dismissing it by telling you it should not exist will not make it go away. When you say no to someone, particularly when you have historically said yes to everything, you will feel guilty. That is not a sign that you have done something wrong. That is your nervous system responding to the violation of a deeply conditioned pattern. Your nervous system learned, a long time ago, that saying no led to consequences that felt threatening, that it produced conflict or disapproval or rejection or the withdrawal of warmth. And it stored that learning in the form of a threat response that activates automatically whenever a no appears imminent. The guilt is not a moral signal. It is a conditioned alarm, and like all conditioned alarms, it gradually loses its intensity when the expected catastrophe consistently fails to arrive. This is the first and most important reframe you need to carry with you. Guilt, after saying no, is not evidence that the no was wrong. It is evidence that the no was new. Those are not the same thing. And the ability to act in alignment with your own needs and values, even while feeling guilty, to let the guilt be present without allowing it to override your decision, is a skill that develops through practice. Not through the elimination of the feeling, but through the development of a relationship with it in which you are no longer automatically controlled by its presence. Now let us talk about the explanations. Because one of the most persistent traps of people-pleasing is the belief that a no requires an elaborate justification in order to be legitimate. That you need to have a good enough reason, a reason that the other person will accept and deem sufficient, before your refusal can be considered valid. And so you construct explanations, sometimes true and sometimes exaggerated and sometimes invented outright, designed not primarily to communicate your genuine situation, but to make the no palatable enough that the other person will not press further or withdraw their regard for you. The problem is that an explanation is an invitation to negotiate. The moment you offer a reason, you implicitly open the door to the possibility that the other person might counter with why that reason is insufficient, or offer to solve the problem your reason describes, thereby removing your stated grounds for refusal and putting you back at yes by default. A no does not require a reason to be valid. This is perhaps the single most important concept in this entire chapter, and it will feel, the first several times you attempt to apply it, profoundly wrong, like rudeness, like selfishness, like a violation of some unspoken social contract you have always believed yourself obligated to honor. But examine that belief carefully. When someone says no to you, do you routinely demand a detailed justification? Do you hold their refusal in suspense until they have offered you reasons you personally find satisfying? Almost certainly not, because you understand, at least in that direction, that people are allowed to have limits, that those limits do not require your approval to be real, and that demanding explanations for them would be a form of aggression dressed up as reasonable conversation. You are allowed the same standard. Your no is complete without annotation. A simple, honest, warm no is not a rejection of the person making the request. It is a communication about your own capacity or willingness at this particular moment. It is a boundary. And a boundary, held calmly and without excessive justification, is one of the most mature and respectful things you can offer another person. Because it is honest in a way that a resentful yes never is. There are practical dimensions to this. When you are first practicing saying no after a long history of not doing so, it helps to have a small number of phrases that feel natural enough in your own voice that you can actually use them without locking up entirely. Something as simple as that does not work for me. Or, I am not able to do that. Or, I am going to pass on that. Not a novel. Not an apology tour. A clear, direct, non-hostile statement that communicates the answer without opening a negotiation or performing a penance. You can be warm and still be clear. Warmth and clarity are not opposites. A no delivered with genuine kindness in your tone is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of honesty. And honesty of that kind, over time, builds far more genuine trust than any number of resentful yeses ever could. There will be people who push back when you say no. People who ask why, or who express disappointment with a degree of force designed to make the discomfort of the pushback greater than the discomfort of simply capitulating. When this happens, you are not obligated to escalate the explanation, or to produce better reasons, or to apologize more elaborately. You are allowed to simply repeat the no, calmly and without additional decoration. I understand you are disappointed. I am still not able to do that. That is a complete sentence. It does not require your distress to be performed in order to prove that you mean it. And about the people who respond to your no with anger or withdrawal of affection or sustained punishment through their behavior, those responses tell you something important. They tell you that the relationship, in its current configuration, is not one of mutual respect. It is one in which your yes was expected and your no is treated as a violation. That is not a friendship or a partnership or a collegial relationship. That is a dynamic built on the assumption that you will continuously override your own needs to maintain the other person's comfort. And while that information is painful to receive, it is also, eventually, clarifying in a way that nothing else is. Because relationships that cannot survive your honest limits were never actually as solid as they appeared. Say no. Feel the guilt. Let the guilt be there. Stay with your decision anyway. Do this enough times, across enough situations, and something that currently feels impossible will gradually become the most ordinary thing in the world. Chapter 8. Setting strong, unshakable boundaries. Most people think of a boundary as a rule they announce to someone else, a declaration of what is and is not acceptable, stated clearly at the start of a conversation or a relationship, after which the other person is expected to observe it. And if they do not observe it, you remind them of it. If they still do not observe it, you somehow enforce it. This understanding of boundaries is extremely common and almost entirely wrong, and it is the reason so many people try to set boundaries and find that they do not hold. Because a boundary is not a rule you state. A boundary is a decision you make about what you will and will not participate in, and then follow through on with your actions, regardless of whether the other person agrees. Let that distinction land. A boundary lives in your behavior, not in the other person's agreement to observe it. You do not need anyone's permission to hold a boundary. You do not need anyone to acknowledge it as fair or reasonable or justified. You do not need the other person to change for the boundary to be real and to have real effects. What you need is the willingness to act in alignment with your own stated limit. When that limit is crossed, even when acting in alignment is uncomfortable, even when it costs you something, even when the other person expresses displeasure with your choice to hold firm. This distinction matters enormously for people pleasers, because the version of boundary setting they most commonly attempt is a version that still places the power in someone else's hands. They say what they need. They wait to see if the other person will respect it. If the person does not respect it, they repeat the statement with slightly more emphasis or slightly more distress in their voice, and wait again. And when the person continues not to respect it, they feel helpless. They feel as though the boundary has failed, when in fact the boundary was never fully formed to begin with, because it was stated but not backed by a willingness to actually follow through on the consequence when it mattered. A real boundary comes with a consequence, and that consequence is something you control entirely. not a threat directed at the other person, not a punishment you are warning them of, but a change in your own behavior that you will implement because the limit has been crossed. If you continue to speak to me this way, I will leave the room. If this pattern does not change, I will not be able to continue this relationship in its current form. If that happens again, I will not be available for this. These are not threats. These are honest communications about what you will and will not participate in, backed by genuine intention to act on them. And the acting on them is the part that most people-pleasing patterns make nearly impossible. Because acting on a consequence almost always involves some degree of conflict or disappointment or discomfort. And the people-pleasing machinery exists precisely to avoid those things. This is why boundaries require something that goes deeper than technique. They require a foundational belief, built through the kind of slow internal work described in the previous chapter, that your own well-being is worth protecting, even at the cost of someone else's temporary displeasure. Without that belief operating at some genuine level, boundaries will remain something you know about intellectually but cannot sustain in practice. Because every time the consequence is required, the fear of conflict or rejection will be louder than the commitment to the limit. And you will fold, and the other person will learn from your actions that the boundary was not real. Now let us talk about where boundaries actually come from, because this matters more than most boundary conversations acknowledge. A boundary is not arbitrary. It is not a list of preferences you have decided to enforce. It is a natural extension of your values, of the things you know with genuine certainty that you cannot continue experiencing without being diminished in some specific way. The most durable and most sustainable boundaries are the ones that are deeply connected to something you actually care about protecting: your peace of mind, your sense of dignity, your time, your energy, your physical safety. When a boundary is rooted in something you genuinely value rather than something you think you are supposed to want, holding it becomes significantly less difficult. Not easy, particularly at first, but less difficult. Because the thing you are protecting feels real, and the cost of not protecting it also feels real. This means that before you can set effective boundaries, you need to spend some time getting clear on what you actually value. Not what you are supposed to value, not what sounds admirable when stated aloud, but what genuinely matters to you when you are honest with yourself in private. What situations consistently drain you in ways that feel like violations of something important? What interactions leave you feeling diminished or disrespected in ways that accumulate over time? What patterns in your relationships make you feel used or invisible or chronically less than? The answers to these questions are not just complaints. They are navigational data. They are pointing you toward exactly the places where your most important and most urgent boundaries need to be built. It also needs to be said clearly: the people in your life who have benefited from the absence of your limits are not going to be uniformly delighted when those limits begin to appear. Some of them will push back. Some will test the limits to see if they hold. Some will express genuine hurt or confusion or anger. Some will tell you that you have changed, that you are being selfish, that you are being difficult, that you are being unreasonable. And here is what you need to understand about those responses. They are not evidence that the boundary is wrong. They are evidence that the boundary is real. The people around you have calibrated their behavior to the version of you that had no limits. The appearance of limits requires them to recalibrate. That recalibration is sometimes experienced as loss, as a renegotiation they did not consent to. Your job is not to apologize for the renegotiation. Your job is to hold steady while it happens. Some of the relationships in your life will not survive the appearance of genuine limits. That is a hard thing to say, and a harder thing to experience. But the relationships that dissolve when you begin honoring your own needs were never built on the foundation you thought they were. They were built on your accommodation, and that means they were never actually as close or as real as they appeared. The relationships that are real, the ones built on genuine mutual regard, rather than on the convenient availability of what you were willing to give, will survive. They may require renegotiation, they may go through a period of adjustment, they may involve some honest and difficult conversations, but they will survive because they are built on something more durable than your compliance. Hold the line, even when it is uncomfortable, especially when it is uncomfortable, because a boundary you abandon the moment it is tested is not a boundary at all. It is a suggestion. And the difference between those two things is the difference between the life you have been living and the life that is possible. Chapter 9. Handling the backlash. When you finally stop pleasing. When you begin to change, people will react. Not all of them, and not always in the ways you fear. But some of them will react with a degree of force that surprises you, and that is designed, consciously or not, to push you back into the familiar pattern. This is one of the most important things to understand before you begin making these changes in earnest, because if you go in unprepared for it, the backlash will feel like confirmation that you made a mistake, that you went too far, that the old way, however unhappy it made you, was at least stable, at least predictable, at least safe, in a way that whatever you are becoming does not yet feel. The backlash is not confirmation that you made a mistake. It is confirmation that the change is real. Let us be very clear about what is actually happening when someone reacts with anger or hurt or withdrawal to your new behavior. What is happening is that a dynamic they had learned to rely on has shifted without their permission. They had internalized a set of expectations about how you would behave, about what you would agree to, about what they could bring to you without risk of refusal. And those expectations were meeting some of their needs, perhaps very significant needs, in ways they may not have been fully conscious of. When you change, those expectations are violated, and the reaction to violated expectations is often, in human beings, something that looks very much like anger. That anger is not primarily about you. It is about the change. It is about the discomfort of needing to recalibrate. And while it will be directed at you, and while it will feel very personal, and while it will be delivered in language specifically designed to make you feel that you have done something wrong, it is important that you do not allow it to be the primary input into your decision about whether to continue, because if the backlash is enough to make you retreat, then the only lesson learned by everyone in the situation is that sufficient pressure will always restore the old arrangement, which means the next boundary will require even more courage to attempt, because the precedent established is that boundaries, under sufficient pressure, collapse. There are specific things people say to people-pleasers who are in the process of changing, and it helps to hear them in advance so they do not catch you completely off guard. Someone will tell you that you have changed, delivered in a tone that makes clear they do not mean it as a compliment. And you need to hear that and be able to say, inside your own mind, if not out loud, yes, I have. That is accurate. Someone will tell you that you are being selfish, usually in a context where what they mean is that you are no longer prioritizing their needs above your own in the specific way they prefer. And you need to be able to hold the clear distinction between genuine selfishness, which is a real thing that exists and matters, and the act of simply taking your own needs seriously, which is not selfishness at all, but basic self-respect. Someone will tell you that you have become cold, or difficult, or hard to be around. These characterizations almost always appear when someone has discovered that the version of you they preferred was the version that asked for nothing and agreed with everything. And the discomfort of encountering a version with limits is being expressed as a critique of your character. None of these statements are verdicts. They are reactions. And there is a crucial difference. There is also the more subtle form of backlash that is harder to identify because it does not look like anger. It looks like sadness or confusion or hurt. It looks like someone who was genuinely attached to the old dynamic, who derived real comfort or security from your consistent availability and accommodation, experiencing genuine loss as that dynamic changes. This form of backlash is harder to navigate because it activates your empathy rather than your defensiveness. It makes you want to fix it, to restore the comfort, to absorb the pain you have caused. And you need to be able to feel genuine compassion for that person's adjustment, while simultaneously not using their discomfort as a reason to undo the changes you are making. Both of those things are possible at the same time. Compassion and firmness are not mutually exclusive. You can care deeply about someone's experience without allowing that experience to override your commitment to your own well-being. Throughout all of this, the most important thing you can do is stay connected to your reasons. The reasons you started this process, the cost you were paying before, the person you were becoming, or perhaps more accurately, the person you were failing to be, under the weight of the old pattern. When the backlash is loud and the guilt is real and the pull toward the old way is strong, those reasons are what you return to, not as a weapon, not as a justification you brandish in someone else's face, but as a private anchor, something you hold in yourself that reminds you why this discomfort is worth sustaining, why the temporary difficulty of navigating other people's reactions to your growth is a price worth paying for the life on the other side of it. Because there is a life on the other side of it. And it is not a life without difficulty or conflict or challenging moments, but it is a life in which those things are encountered as a person who trusts themselves. A person who knows what they value and acts in alignment with it. A person who does not spend every interaction monitoring for signs of disapproval, managing other people's emotions, running calculations about how much of themselves they can safely show. A person who is simply, straightforwardly, genuinely present in their own life. That person is who you are becoming. And the backlash is simply the last defense of the old arrangement, trying to keep you from arriving there. Stay the course. The noise is temporary. The change is permanent. Chapter 10. Building a life driven by self-respect, not approval. At some point in this process, something subtle but profound begins to shift. It does not arrive as a dramatic moment. It is not a single conversation, or a single decision, or a single day when you wake up and feel categorically different from the person you were before. It arrives the way most real change arrives, incrementally, and without announcement, in the texture of ordinary moments, in the way a conversation feels when you are actually present in it rather than monitoring it from a slight remove, in the quality of your own company when you are no longer performing even for an audience of one, in the specific, unfamiliar lightness that comes from realizing you have moved through an entire interaction without checking anyone else's face for evidence of your own acceptability. This is the beginning of a life driven by self-respect rather than by approval, and it is worth spending time understanding what that actually means in practice. Because it is easy to misunderstand it as something colder or more isolated than it actually is. A life driven by self-respect is not a life in which you stop caring about other people. That is a common misreading of what the recovery from people-pleasing looks like, and it causes unnecessary fear about what is being given up. You do not become indifferent to the people around you. You do not become hard or unavailable or selfish in the genuine sense of that word. What you become is honest. And honesty in a relationship, as uncomfortable as it can sometimes be to produce, is the foundation of something far more durable and far more nourishing than the comfortable fiction of unlimited agreement and accommodation. When you stop organizing your choices around the management of other people's approval, you discover something surprising. The relationships that remain and the ones you begin to form from this new foundation are qualitatively different from anything you experienced before. They are built on something real. They are built on the knowledge, held by both parties, that what you offer is genuine. That when you say yes, it is because you actually want to, not because you are afraid of what happens if you say no. That when you show warmth and care and generosity, it comes from a full place rather than from the anxious calculation of someone who has learned that giving is the only safe currency. The people who receive that kind of honesty from you receive something far more valuable than the performance of limitless accommodation. They receive the truth of who you are, and that, for anyone worth having in your life, is incomparably more meaningful. Self-respect also changes the relationship you have with your own work, your own time, and your own daily experience, in ways that are difficult to fully anticipate until you are living them. When you are not spending enormous quantities of cognitive and emotional energy monitoring and managing and pleasing, that energy does not simply disappear. It becomes available for things that actually matter to you, for the projects and the ideas and the relationships and the experiences that your authentic self is actually drawn to, rather than the ones you have been performing enthusiasm about in order to appear acceptable. Many people discover, as they recover from people-pleasing, that they have interests and opinions and aesthetic preferences and creative instincts they barely knew existed, because those things had no room to surface in a life organized entirely around other people's needs. The practice of building this life is the practice of asking yourself, with genuine curiosity and genuine patience, what you actually want, not what is expected of you, not what would be most convenient for the people around you, not what the version of you who was trying to be loved would choose. What you, the real and increasingly visible and increasingly inhabitable you, actually want. From this day, this conversation, this relationship, this season of your life, that question, asked consistently and answered honestly, becomes the compass that replaces approval as the primary navigation tool. And it turns out to be a far more reliable one, because approval is contingent on too many external variables to ever serve as stable guidance. But your own honest wants and values, though they require attention and practice to hear clearly, are always pointing towards something real. Living from self-respect also means changing your relationship to failure and to judgment in ways that have cascading effects on everything else. When your primary fear is disapproval, every mistake becomes a potential catastrophe, because mistakes invite exactly the judgment you most dread. This means you take fewer risks, stay closer to the proven and the safe, prioritize the outcome that is most likely to be approved over the one that is most aligned with your own values and desires. And that chronic risk aversion keeps your life smaller than it has any business being. When self-respect becomes the foundation instead, failure is recontextualized, not into something comfortable or irrelevant, but into something survivable, into information, into the inevitable texture of a life being lived actively rather than cautiously performed for an audience that has opinions about everything. There is also the matter of solitude and how your relationship to it changes. People pleasers often have an uncomfortable relationship with genuine quiet, because quiet is where they are alone with the version of themselves they have been running from. The version that has unmet needs and honest opinions and genuine feelings that were never given space to be expressed. As those things are gradually given room, as the internal relationship improves, solitude changes character entirely. It stops being the place where anxiety lives and becomes instead the place where clarity arrives, where you can hear yourself think without the constant interference of monitoring and managing, where you can simply rest in your own company without performing even the smallest version of self-management for an invisible audience. This is, ultimately, what all of this work has been building toward. Not a perfectly boundary-maintained life in which nothing uncomfortable ever reaches you. Not a version of yourself that never feels the pull of old patterns or the temptation to smooth things over with a dishonest yes, but a life in which you are recognizably yourself in every situation you navigate, in which the person you present to the world is continuous with the person who exists in private, in which your relationships are real because you are real within them, in which your choices reflect what you genuinely value rather than what you are afraid of losing, in which you wake up with some reasonable regularity and feel, without having to construct the feeling from external materials, that your life belongs to you. That is not a small thing. That is not a minor upgrade from one way of being to a slightly better one. That is the difference between a life spent auditioning and a life spent living. Between moving through the world as a version of yourself calibrated for maximum acceptability and moving through it as the actual person you are, with all the complexity and the specificity and the occasional inconvenience that entails. You spent a very long time learning to disappear in service of being accepted. The work from here is simpler in its direction, though not always easy in its practice. The work from here is to reappear, steadily, honestly, without apology, and to discover, as you do, that the version of yourself you spent so long hiding was never the problem. It was always the answer. Chapter 11. The relationships worth keeping. As you move through this process of changing, as you begin to hold limits and speak honestly and show up as a more complete version of yourself, the landscape of your relationships will shift in ways that are sometimes disorienting and sometimes quietly clarifying and occasionally painful in ways you were not fully prepared for. Some connections will strengthen, some will weaken, some will end. And the end of a relationship that you valued even one that was built on dynamics that were not healthy for you, carries a real grief that deserves to be acknowledged rather than bypassed with reassurances that it was for the best. It may well be for the best. It can still hurt. Both of those things can be true at the same time. But before we talk about what ends, it is worth spending serious time on what becomes possible. Because one of the most significant and least discussed gifts of recovering from people-pleasing is the quality of relationship that opens up once you are no longer bringing a performance to every connection you have. Once you are no longer playing a role designed for maximum acceptability rather than maximum authenticity, once the other person in the room is encountering you rather than the carefully managed version of you that was constructed to avoid their disapproval, real relationships, the ones worth keeping and building and investing in, are built on a specific and irreplaceable ingredient. The ingredient is mutual reality. Both people in the relationship need to be actually present, actually themselves, actually willing to show the parts of themselves that are uncertain or complicated or inconvenient alongside the parts that are easy and appealing. Relationships built on one person performing and the other person receiving the performance are not deep, however long they last and however warm they feel in their better moments. They are relationships between a person and a role. And you have been playing that role for so long, in so many of your closest connections, that you may not know yet what it would feel like to be in a relationship where the role is not required. It would feel like rest. That is the closest approximation. Like setting down something very heavy that you had been carrying for so long, you stopped registering the weight of it. And the people who can offer you that rest, who are secure enough in themselves to be in relationship with someone who has genuine edges, who do not require your continuous accommodation in order to feel okay about themselves and about you, those people are the ones worth every ounce of the effort this process demands. They exist, and one of the effects of you becoming more genuinely yourself is that you become far more visible to them, because they were never particularly attracted to the performance version. They are attracted to the real one. How do you identify a relationship worth keeping through this transition? Not through what the other person says in the easy moments, but through how they respond in the harder ones. A person who genuinely cares about you, and not just about the dynamic you represented for them, will be able to tolerate the discomfort of your growth. They may need time to adjust. They may have questions or even moments of hurt as the dynamic shifts. But they will ultimately be able to hold those things without punishing you for them. They will be able to have honest conversations about what is changing, without making the conversation an exercise in pressuring you to change back. They will demonstrate, through their behavior rather than just their words, that their investment is in you rather than in the specific role you used to play for them. A relationship worth keeping is also one where repair is possible after conflict. People-pleasers often avoid all conflict so assiduously that they never discover whether their relationships can survive it. They smooth things over, absorb the discomfort, pretend the friction did not happen, and maintain a surface of apparent harmony that sits on top of an entirely unexamined set of unresolved tensions. Part of what changes when you stop pleasing is that some of those tensions surface, and discovering which of your relationships can move through that process and come out the other side with more honesty and more depth and more genuine closeness is one of the most important and most rewarding discoveries this period of your life will make available to you. Conflict does not destroy real relationships. Sustained dishonesty does. The absence of conflict in your history with someone is not evidence that the relationship is healthy. It may simply be evidence that you have been working very hard to prevent any situation that might require the relationship to demonstrate its actual resilience. Real resilience in a relationship shows up when there is a rupture and both people choose repair over retreat. When something difficult gets said and both people stay in the room. When a limit is set and the other person is able to hear it, and, after whatever adjustment is required, respect it. Those moments of repair are what create genuine closeness. The kind that does not depend on everything going smoothly and both parties staying comfortable. The kind that knows it has been tested and held. There are also, in most people's lives, relationships that are worth investing in that may have been somewhat neglected during years of people-pleasing. Connections with people who were perhaps less demanding, less in need of management, less likely to create the kind of interpersonal crisis that tends to pull people-pleasers' attention and energy disproportionately. The people who never needed you to perform for them are sometimes the ones who got the least of you, precisely because they never required you to show up with the full force of your accommodating machinery activated as you recover, as you have more genuine energy available, because you are spending less of it on monitoring and managing. Look toward those connections, the ones that were quieter, but perhaps more real. They may have more to offer than you realized when your attention was being consumed elsewhere. Ultimately, the question of which relationships are worth keeping is not answered by an audit performed at the beginning of this process. It is answered gradually, through the evidence that accumulates as you show up differently and watch what happens. Some relationships will surprise you with their durability. Some will surprise you with their fragility. And some that you thought might not survive will become, on the far side of an honest and sometimes difficult renegotiation, the most important connections you have. Give them the chance to demonstrate which they are. Give yourself the chance to find out. And through all of it, extend to yourself the same patience and compassion you would extend to someone you love going through a difficult transition. Changing the relational patterns of a lifetime is not a linear process. There will be moments when the old reflexes win, when the yes escapes before the honest answer can form, when the limit dissolves under pressure that felt too significant to hold against. Those moments are not failures. They are information. They show you where the work still has depth to go, where the pattern is most entrenched, which relationships and which emotional triggers require the most sustained attention. What matters is not that you never revert. What matters is that you notice when you do, understand why, and return to your own center rather than treating the reversion as proof that change is impossible. It is not impossible. You are already proving that by being here, reading this, choosing to take seriously something that the old version of you would have set aside as too uncomfortable to examine. Chapter 12. Rediscovering who you actually are. Here is a question that most people assume has an obvious answer, until they are asked to sit with it seriously. Who are you when no one is watching? Not who you present yourself as in the presence of a boss or a partner or a group of friends whose approval matters to you. Not the version of you that shows up in any of the social contexts that have been, for most of your life, the primary arena in which your sense of self was constructed and maintained. Who are you when the audience is gone? When the performance is not required? When there is no one present whose reaction you need to monitor and manage? What do you think about? What do you feel? What do you actually want to do with this particular hour or evening or Saturday morning when no external structure is imposing itself? If you sat with that question and felt something that was less like clarity and more like a blankness, a certain emptiness or uncertainty that was vaguely uncomfortable, you are not alone. People who have spent years operating primarily in relation to other people's needs and preferences often discover, when they turn the focus inward, that the inward landscape is less familiar than they expected. Not because there is nothing there, but because so little attention has been directed there for so long. The self that exists independent of the social performance has been present all along. It has simply been starved of the attention required to become visible, to itself and to anyone else. Rediscovering who you actually are is not a dramatic or instant process. It does not happen through a single moment of revelation or a weekend retreat or a conversation that suddenly makes everything clear. It happens through a sustained and deliberate practice of paying attention to yourself in the way you have been paying attention to everyone else for years. Noticing what you actually like, not just what you like to say you like in company that you want to impress. Noticing what genuinely interests you. What kinds of experiences leave you feeling more like yourself rather than less? Noticing what your actual emotional responses are before you translate them into whatever version feels safer to express. Noticing your own preferences in the smallest and most ordinary things, because those small things add up to a person, and the person they add up to is you. Start with the physical and the immediate. What do you actually want to eat when no one else's preferences are part of the equation? What music do you put on when you are alone? What kind of environments make you feel more alive, and which ones deplete you? These are not trivial questions. They are the vocabulary of a self that you are in the process of learning to hear again. And the practice of honoring those small preferences, of making choices based on what you genuinely want, rather than what seems most acceptable or least likely to attract comment, is where the larger work of self-rediscovery begins. In the accumulation of very small, very honest choices made in private. Then, move to the deeper material. What did you care about before other people's needs became the primary organizing principle of your attention? What were you interested in before you learned to be interested in whatever the people around you found interesting? What kind of person did you imagine becoming when you were young enough that the shape of the future felt open? What would you be doing with your time if approval were completely off the table, if no one's opinion of your choices had any weight at all? The answers to those questions are not necessarily prescriptions for life changes, not necessarily directions to quit your job or move cities or fundamentally restructure your existence, though sometimes they are. They are more fundamentally just data, information about a self that was submerged, a beginning of an honest account of who you are, when who you are is not being negotiated in relation to what others prefer. One of the consistent experiences of people recovering from people-pleasing is the rediscovery of opinions. Actual, strong, personally held opinions about things that genuinely matter to them. Opinions that were suppressed for so long that they almost stopped being aware they had them. And then gradually, in the context of safer relationships, or in the privacy of their own thinking, those opinions begin to surface again, and they discover that they have views, that they have aesthetic preferences and intellectual positions and moral commitments and tastes that are specifically their own and not derived from the preferences of the people around them. This rediscovery can feel strange and vulnerable at first, like exposing something that spent a long time protected, but it is also, almost invariably, accompanied by a quality of aliveness that the performance state never produced. There is also the matter of the things you were told you were not good at or not suited for. The interests you abandoned because they attracted insufficient approval or active discouragement. The parts of yourself that were too unusual or too inconvenient or too different from what your environment valued to be safely maintained. Not all of those things will turn out to be important. Some of them were simply phases or experiments, legitimately outgrown rather than suppressed. But some of them will turn out to matter. Some of them will turn out to be connected to something real about who you are. And their rediscovery will feel less like learning something new and more like remembering something you always knew. Be patient with this process. Selves that have been suppressed for many years do not resurface all at once. They come back in pieces, in glimpses, in moments of unexpected pleasure or unexpected preference or unexpected reaction. Your job is not to hurry the process or to construct a new identity on top of the old one with the same urgency you once brought to constructing yourself for other people's approval. Your job is to stay curious, to pay attention, to give the emerging version of you the same quality of attentive interest you have spent years giving to everyone else. That investment, made consistently over time, will return something that nothing else in this process can provide. A self that feels genuinely and continuously yours. There is one more thing worth saying about this rediscovery. It will not always be comfortable. Some of what you find when you turn genuinely inward, some of the honest preferences and real opinions and unfiltered feelings that surface when the performance is no longer running, will be things you have to reckon with. Feelings of anger about things that were never adequately addressed. Grief about time spent in patterns that cost you more than you fully acknowledged while you were in them. Desires and directions and authentic inclinations that complicate the life you have already built. This discomfort is not a sign that the self-discovery is going wrong. It is a sign that it is going deep. And depth in this process is always preferable to the comfortable surface of a rediscovery that only recovers the easy and appealing parts while leaving the harder ones untouched. The full self is the only self worth recovering. And the full self includes everything. Chapter 13. When the people you love are the hardest to say no to. Everything described in the earlier chapters of this book sounds manageable enough when you apply it to co-workers, acquaintances, people in your life whose approval matters, but whose relationships with you are not central to your sense of who you are. Saying no to a colleague asking for a favor, holding a limit with someone in your social circle, being honest about your preferences with a friend of several years rather than the decades-deep kind. These things are difficult, but they are a difficulty you can intellectually prepare for and practically navigate. Then there are the other people, the ones whose approval you have been seeking the longest, the ones whose love or disappointment carries a weight that makes every other social pressure seem mild by comparison. The parents, the partners, the siblings, the oldest and most foundational relationships in your life. And with those people, everything is harder. This is not a weakness. It is the accurate recognition that some relationships are more load-bearing than others, that some people's responses to you are more deeply entangled with your sense of who you are and what you deserve, and that the history in those relationships carries a gravity that relatively newer connections simply do not. The people-pleasing patterns you formed in your earliest family relationships were the original ones, the template. Every subsequent pattern of accommodation and self-suppression was built on the foundation of what you learned to do in that first environment, which means that changing those patterns in the context of those relationships, or in the context of the relationships that have acquired similar depth and significance over years of closeness, is the deepest and most demanding work this process will ask of you. Let us begin with family, because for most people, it is where the blueprint was drawn. The family system is a particular kind of environment for personal change, because every family system develops its own equilibrium, its own set of unspoken rules about how each member is expected to behave, what roles they are expected to occupy, what kinds of interactions are permitted, and what kinds are not. In a family where one person occupies the role of the accommodating one, the peacekeeper, the one who manages everyone else's feelings, and makes themselves smaller so that the overall family atmosphere can remain stable, that role becomes structural over time. It becomes part of how the family functions. And when the person in that role begins to change, it is not just their individual behavior that is affected. It is the entire equilibrium of the system. This is why family members sometimes react to personal growth with a degree of force that is entirely disproportionate to the apparent size of the change. A boundary that would be unremarkable coming from someone with a different history in the family, stated quietly and without drama, can produce a reaction that feels enormous. Because what is actually happening is not just one person responding to one request. It is a system responding to the disturbance of its established order. And systems, like people, have a strong instinct toward maintaining whatever equilibrium they have developed, even when that equilibrium is built on the suppression of one of its members. Understanding this does not make navigating it easy, but it makes it less confusing and less likely to be misread as evidence that you have done something uniquely and specifically wrong. When a parent responds to your new limit with expressions of profound hurt, or a sibling reacts to your honest communication with accusations of selfishness, or a family gathering shifts in atmosphere, the moment you begin acting in alignment with your own needs rather than with the role the family has assigned you, these are not primarily judgments of your character. They are the system's attempt to restore a familiar pattern. And you have the option, possibly for the first time in your life, of declining to be restored. Partners present a particular complexity that deserves its own attention. If you entered a significant relationship while deep in people-pleasing patterns, which many people do, then that relationship was established with a specific version of you at its center. A version that accommodated more, agreed more, and asked for less than the version of you that is now emerging. Your partner organized their understanding of the relationship, and to some degree, their understanding of themselves within it, around that version. When you begin to change, you are not just changing as an individual. You are changing the terms of the relationship. And depending on how your partner is constituted, and what they genuinely need and genuinely value, this can either be the beginning of a deeper and more honest relationship than you have ever had with them, or the revelation of a fundamental incompatibility that the people-pleasing was papering over all along. This is one of the most difficult truths in this entire book. Some relationships that have been sustained by one person's continuous accommodation will not be able to survive the cessation of that accommodation. Not because the people in them are bad, but because the accommodation was doing structural work, was filling a gap that exists at the foundation of the connection, was compensating for a fundamental mismatch that genuine honesty reveals rather than creates. And facing that possibility with honesty is among the most painful things the recovery from people-pleasing can require. It is also, in the long run, among the most necessary. For the relationships that can survive and grow, the path forward runs through honest conversation. Not confrontational, not accusatory, not the performance of newfound assertiveness for its own sake, but genuine communication about what you have been doing, what it has cost you, what is changing, and what you need from this relationship going forward. Those conversations are difficult. They are the kind of difficult that produces something real on the other side. The kind of honest reckoning between two people who are committed to actually knowing each other rather than performing for each other. And for the partner who genuinely loves you and is secure enough to hear you, those conversations are not a threat. They are an invitation. An invitation to a more honest and more nourishing version of the connection you already have. The hardest moment in all of this is the moment when someone you love deeply and genuinely reacts to your honesty or your limits or your changed behavior with something that feels like the withdrawal of their love. When a parent goes cold, when a partner becomes distant, when a sibling stops calling, that experience activates the most ancient and most primal fear that people-pleasing exists to prevent, the fear that you are unlovable without the performance, that the love was always contingent, that the moment you stopped being convenient, you stopped being loved. Sitting with that fear, allowing it to be present without immediately acting to dissolve it by reverting to the old behavior, is among the hardest things this process will ever ask of you. And it is also, if you can sustain it, the thing that will show you with definitive clarity what was actually there. Because love that disappears the moment you become genuinely yourself was not love of you, and love that remains adjusted and perhaps initially uncomfortable but genuinely present is the only kind that ever actually counted. Chapter 14. The daily practice of valuing yourself. There is a version of this process that people sometimes imagine when they first begin to understand what people-pleasing is and why it needs to change. The version where you arrive, after sufficient work, at a permanent state of self-possession that does not require ongoing maintenance, where the patterns are dissolved and the wounds are healed, and the new way of being is so thoroughly established that it simply runs without effort, the way a healthy habit eventually does. That version is a comfort to imagine. It is also not quite accurate, not because the growth is not real, not because the patterns do not genuinely weaken and recede, but because valuing yourself is not a state you arrive at and then inhabit passively. It is something you practice every day, in the specific and unglamorous texture of ordinary life, through small choices that accumulate over time into a fundamentally different relationship with who you are. This chapter is about what that practice actually looks like. Not in the abstract, but in the daily and the particular. It begins in the morning, in the very first set of choices you make before the day has imposed its full weight of demand and expectation. What you choose to do with the first portion of your day before other people's needs enter the picture tells you something significant about how much you are genuinely prioritizing your own experience. Not that mornings need to be sacred or ritualized in any particular way, but the question of whether you are beginning the day from a place of genuine connection with your own needs and intentions, or whether the first act of every day is already the management of someone else's requirements, is a meaningful one. People who have recovered from severe people-pleasing often describe the reclamation of some portion of the morning for their own mental and emotional calibration as one of the most practically significant changes they made. Not because mornings are magical, but because beginning from your own center, however briefly, creates a different foundation for everything that follows. It continues through the day in the quality of attention you bring to your own internal experience. People pleasers have an extraordinarily well-developed capacity to monitor other people's states and a correspondingly underdeveloped capacity to monitor their own. They know almost immediately when someone around them is uncomfortable or displeased or in need of something. They often have no clear idea what they themselves are feeling, until the feeling has become so strong it can no longer be ignored. The daily practice of valuing yourself includes developing a practice of regular, honest self-check-ins, not elaborate or time-consuming ones, simple and direct ones. What am I feeling right now? What do I need right now? Am I honoring those things in how I am moving through this moment, or am I overriding them for reasons that no longer actually serve me? These questions, asked with genuine curiosity several times across the day, begin to rebuild the connection to your own interior experience that years of externalizing your attention has eroded. The practice includes the daily management of your commitments. People pleasers tend to operate with calendars and schedules that are organized around other people's needs and requests, with their own priorities consistently placed in whatever space remains after every external demand has been accommodated, which is often very little space indeed. Changing this requires the deliberate and ongoing practice of treating your own commitments to yourself with the same seriousness you bring to your commitments to others. If you have decided that something matters to you, whether it is time for creative work or physical movement or simple unstructured rest, that commitment deserves to be protected with the same degree of firmness you would bring to a professional appointment or a promise made to someone else. The idea that your commitments to yourself are negotiable while your commitments to others are fixed is one of the most practically damaging aspects of people-pleasing, and reversing it requires consistent, deliberate practice rather than a single decision. It includes the way you speak about yourself, not in the performing humility way that people-pleasers have often mastered. The way of preemptively diminishing yourself before anyone else can, of prefacing your contributions with statements about your own inadequacy, of framing your needs or perspectives as probably wrong or potentially unreasonable before they have even been received. That particular habit is a form of self-abandonment performed in language, and it perpetuates internally the same dynamic you are trying to dismantle externally. The practice of speaking about yourself with neutral honesty, not with inflated pride but without reflexive diminishment, is more demanding than it sounds and more consequential than it appears. The practice includes how you respond to compliments. People pleasers are often extraordinarily uncomfortable receiving positive acknowledgement from others, because receiving it requires a moment of allowing something good to be true about you, a moment of not deflecting or minimizing or immediately redirecting attention toward the person offering the compliment. Learning to receive a compliment with a simple, honest thank you is not a trivial thing. It is a small act of allowing yourself to be seen in something favorable and staying with that, rather than immediately collapsing it. It is a micro-practice of tolerating your own worth being reflected back at you without needing to disprove it. The practice includes the choices you make when you are tired, when your resources are depleted and the request arrives anyway, when someone needs something and the automatic system says yes before the conscious one has a chance to weigh in. Learning to pause in those moments, even fractionally, and ask yourself whether you are agreeing because you want to or because you are afraid not to, and then acting on the honest answer regardless of the discomfort it produces, is perhaps the most important daily practice in this entire process. Because the moment of fatigue is the moment when the old patterns have the least resistance to overcome, and it is therefore the moment where the new ones are most powerfully reinforced when they manage to show up. The practice also includes the nightly reckoning, not a harsh self-audit, not a catalogue of every moment you failed to be perfectly boundaried or perfectly self-respecting. A gentle and honest review of the day that simply asks, where did I show up for myself today? And where did I not? What contributed to that? What might I do differently tomorrow? Not to accumulate shame, but to accumulate data, to learn the specific patterns of your own particular version of this struggle so that you can address them with increasing precision over time. The person who goes to bed each night with a slightly clearer understanding of their own patterns and a slightly firmer intention to honor themselves in the next day's particular challenges is a person who is building something real, slowly, without drama, in the unglamorous consistency of the ordinary. That is where the actual work happens, and that is where the actual change is made. One final element of the daily practice deserves mention, and it is the one most likely to be underestimated. It is the practice of celebrating your own progress, not loudly and not for anyone else's benefit, but privately and honestly. People pleasers are often extraordinarily generous in acknowledging other people's growth and extraordinarily reluctant to acknowledge their own. They minimize what they have accomplished, immediately move the goalposts to the next challenge before giving any real recognition to the one just cleared, and treat their own development with a persistent stinginess of acknowledgement that they would never apply to someone they cared about. The deliberate, intentional practice of noticing when you have done something difficult and honoring that fact, of saying to yourself, without irony or qualification, that was hard and I did it anyway, is not self-indulgence. It is the maintenance of the internal conditions that make continued growth possible. You cannot sustain effort in a direction that you never acknowledge moving in. Notice the movement. Let it matter. It is evidence that the person you are becoming is real. Chapter 15. The person you were always meant to be. There is a version of you that has been waiting. Not in some mystical sense, not in some predetermined destiny that was always fixed and has simply been delayed, but in the practical and very real sense that there are dimensions of who you are, capacities and qualities and ways of being in the world that have been held in suspension by the people-pleasing pattern, waiting for enough safety to emerge, waiting for the moment when the cost of continuing to suppress them finally exceeded the cost of allowing them to surface. That moment is now. And what surfaces when the performance is finally released, when the role is finally relinquished, when the continuous management of other people's comfort is no longer the primary organizing activity of your life, is not a stranger. It is someone you recognize. It is, in some essential way, that you may not have expected to feel so clearly, you. But let us talk about what it actually means to be that person. Because this is a chapter about arrival, about what you are arriving at and what life looks like and feels like on the far side of this work. Not to romanticize it, not to make it seem simpler or more peaceful than it is, but to give you the clearest possible picture of what this whole process has been building toward. The first thing that characterizes the person on the other side of this work is a quality of presence, a way of being in a room, in a conversation, in any given moment, that is qualitatively different from what people-pleasing allows. When you are not dividing your attention between your own experience and the surveillance of everyone else's, you are simply here, in the interaction, in the relationship, in the experience itself, rather than in the monitoring of it. This quality of genuine presence is not just pleasant for you. It is something other people feel. It is what makes some people magnetic in ways that have nothing to do with performance or charm or strategic impression management. It is the unmistakable quality of a person who is actually there, actually themselves, actually available in the deepest sense of that word. And it is only available to you when you are no longer spending most of your resources on the management of an image. The second thing is a different relationship to your own emotions. People-pleasers have typically been suppressing significant portions of their emotional experience for a very long time. Most notably the ones that feel socially risky to display: anger, disappointment, grief, genuine fear. The specific kind of vulnerability that comes with expressing a need directly. As the pleasing pattern loosens, those emotions become more available, more accessible. And while this can initially feel destabilizing, like a dam releasing pressure that had been building for years, it moves over time towards something far more valuable, toward a relationship with your own emotional life that is integrated rather than managed, where you feel what you actually feel and can name it and can respond to it in ways that are appropriate to its actual scale without either suppressing it entirely or being overwhelmed by the accumulated backlog of everything you never allowed yourself to express. The third thing is confidence, not the performance of confidence, which is a very common substitute and looks in many ways like the real thing from the outside. But the specific and quiet, and actually quite different internal experience of genuinely trusting yourself, trusting that you can handle the situations that arise, that you can navigate conflict without it destroying you, that you can be wrong and recover from it, that you can disappoint someone and remain standing, that you can encounter disapproval and continue acting in alignment with your own values regardless. This kind of trust is not built through positive thinking or through the repetition of affirmations. It is built through repeated experience of being tested and surviving, through the accumulation of evidence that you are more resilient and more capable than the people-pleasing pattern allowed you to discover. And that evidence is built through exactly the kind of choices this entire process has been preparing you to make. The fourth thing is a change in what you find yourself attracting. This is not magic, and it is not a metaphysical claim. It is a straightforward consequence of becoming genuinely more yourself. When you are no longer performing a version of yourself optimized for maximum acceptability, you become visible to a different set of people. The people who found the performance useful but felt nothing real for the person underneath it begin to drift away or to lose interest. And the people who were always looking for something genuine, who are themselves genuine enough to recognize and value it when they encounter it, begin to move closer. The relationships you form from your authentic self are built on entirely different foundations from the ones built on your accommodation. They are chosen rather than defaulted into. They are reciprocal rather than extractive. They are honest in ways that produce real closeness rather than comfortable but ultimately hollow familiarity. The fifth thing, and perhaps the hardest to fully describe because it is more felt than conceptual, is a sense of being on your own side. People pleasers are, in a very practical and very significant sense, not on their own side. Their internal monologue is not supportive. It is critical, vigilant, perpetually scanning for signs that they have failed to be sufficiently accommodating, sufficiently acceptable, sufficiently whatever the current situation seems to require. The voice inside the head of a person deep in people-pleasing is not a kind one. It is a demanding one, always asking whether you did enough, whether you said the right thing, whether you managed the situation adequately, whether someone somewhere has been given grounds to be disappointed in you. On the other side of this work, that voice changes. Not immediately, and not completely, and not without effort and attention, but gradually, with the same consistency of practice applied to everything else, it becomes something closer to an ally than an auditor, something that notices when you are struggling, and responds with something closer to kindness than accusation, something that is, for the first time, genuinely on your side. This is what you have been working toward through every difficult conversation and every held limit and every moment of sitting with discomfort rather than rushing to dissolve it. Not a perfect life, or a life without complexity, or a life in which the old patterns never surface again. They will surface, particularly under stress, particularly in the contexts where they were most deeply formed. The pull back toward the familiar will be felt, but the experience of that pull will be different. You will feel it and be able to recognize it for what it is, a reflex rather than a truth, an old signal from a system that was built for a different version of your life. And you will have something you did not have before. You will have a choice. The person you were always meant to be is not some idealized and frictionless version of a human being. It is not someone who has transcended difficulty or who never doubts or who moves through every situation with unshakable certainty. It is someone who is honest, honest with other people and honest with themselves, someone who knows what they value and lives in alignment with it as consistently as they are able, someone who takes up the space in this world that belongs to them, not aggressively or at anyone else's expense, but fully and without apology. Someone whose relationships are real because their presence in them is real. Someone who wakes up and moves through their days with the specific and irreplaceable satisfaction of living as themselves rather than as a version of themselves constructed for an audience that was never going to love the performance the way they deserved to be loved. You spent a very long time believing that the path to being loved ran through making yourself acceptable to everyone around you, through shrinking, accommodating, suppressing, and performing. That belief was understandable. It was formed in circumstances where it felt true and necessary. But it was always, at every point in your life, a substitute for the thing you were actually looking for. And the thing you were actually looking for was never available through that route. It was only ever available through this one. Through the slow, sometimes painful, ultimately irreplaceable process of becoming real, of learning to value yourself honestly and consistently and without requiring anyone else's permission to do so, of showing up in your own life as the person who was there all along, waiting to be allowed out. That person is here now. And this is where their story begins.